The small velvet box landed on the kitchen table with a dull, accusing thud. For a second it lay there beside the glass sugar bowl, silent and innocent, yet somehow heavier than anything else in the room. Outside the window the evening rain tapped softly against the grey panels of the apartment block, but inside the kitchen the air felt sharp and cold. Sofia Nikolaevna did not shout. Her voice, however, trembled like a tightened string. "Either you throw this nonsense out of your head right now, or I swear, Pavlo, I don't know what I'll do to myself, because this has gone too far." She stood by the table in her dark house dress, thin shoulders rigid, silver hair arranged with the same strict precision she carried everywhere, even at home. Her pale fingers pointed at the little box as if it were a piece of evidence in a courtroom. Pavlo froze in the doorway. He had just come home from work, still in his coat, smelling faintly of wet asphalt and cold air. For a moment he didn't move. The familiar heaviness in his chest, the old sticky mixture of fear and irritation he remembered from childhood, tightened around his ribs. So she had found it. Slowly he stepped forward. "Mom, please don't start," he said quietly. His hand covered the velvet box, almost protectively, as if shielding it from her gaze. "I'm 32 years old," he added, forcing calm into every word. "Not 12. My life is mine, and I will decide who I propose to." Sofia Nikolaevna laughed. The laugh was short and dry. "Your life?" she repeated, raising her eyebrows. "You call this life? Running after some divorced woman who is older than you and already dragging someone else's child behind her?" Her cheeks flushed with dark red spots, the ones that appeared whenever her blood pressure climbed. "You want to raise another man's boy? Feed him, clothe him, spend your money on him? And what will people say?" she continued bitterly. "What will they say about the mother who raised you alone, who gave you everything?" Pavlo's jaw tightened. "Don't speak about Olena like that." The words came out harder now. "She's a wonderful woman, and her son is a good kid. The fact that her first marriage failed doesn't make her worse than anyone else." "Oh, listen to him!" Sofia threw her hands into the air. "Love, of course, you're in love." She dropped into the chair dramatically, clutching her chest. "This is not love, Pavlo. She trapped you. A clever woman always finds a young fool without his own apartment." Her eyes flashed toward the walls of the kitchen, the small two-room flat she guarded like a fortress. "You still live here," she continued coldly. "Did you think you'd bring her here? Turn my home into a hostel?" The old refrigerator in the corner hummed loudly, filling the sudden silence. Pavlo slipped the box back into his pocket, its sharp edges pressed into his thigh. He looked at his mother, small, dry, perfectly controlled, a woman who had devoted her entire life to being a mother, a devotion so complete that it had slowly become a cage. "We won't live here," he said tiredly. "I've already rented a place." The words seemed to drain the color from her face. "You're leaving?" she whispered. The whisper carried more poison than a scream. "You're abandoning your mother? For her?" For a moment Pavlo said nothing, and in that quiet kitchen, with rain on the window, the ticking wall clock, and the old smell of medicine in the air, something invisible cracked between them. He understood then that this argument was not about Olena. It had never been. It was about a mother who believed her son belonged to her forever, and a son who had finally begun to understand that love can sometimes feel very much like a prison. The silence after his words was so thick that even the old refrigerator seemed to stop humming. Sofia Nikolaevna stared at her son as if she had suddenly discovered a stranger standing in her kitchen. Her thin lips trembled slightly, and for a moment Pavlo almost believed she might cry. But Sofia Mykolaievna did not cry easily. Instead, her eyes narrowed. "So," she said slowly, each word precise and cold, "it has already gone that far." She rose from the chair with surprising energy and walked to the sink, turning the tap on with unnecessary force. Water splashed loudly into the metal basin. "You've already made plans behind my back, rented an apartment, prepared everything." She shook her head. "And you only tell me now." Pavlo leaned against the wall, exhaustion pressing into his bones. The day had been long, and he knew the evening would be even longer. "I didn't hide it," he said quietly. "I just didn't want another scandal." "Oh, another scandal," she repeated bitterly. "Of course. Your mother is the problem again." She turned to face him. "Tell me something, Pavlo. What exactly does this woman want from you?" He exhaled slowly. "She wants nothing. We simply want to live together." Sofia gave a short laugh. "No woman simply wants to live together. Not when she already has a child and a failed marriage behind her." She stepped closer to him. "How old is she again? 36? 37? 36. And the boy?" 7. Sofia clicked her tongue. "Perfect. So you will start your life already halfway through someone else's story." The words stung more than Pavlo expected. He remembered the first time he had seen Olena. It had been 6 months earlier. The elevator in her building had broken, and she was struggling to carry several heavy boxes of laminate flooring up the stairs. Her hair had been tied in a messy knot, streaks of white paint on her cheek. She had laughed when one of the boxes slipped. "Careful," Pavlo had said, catching it before it fell. "Thank you," she replied, breathing hard. "I swear this renovation will kill me before the dust does." Her laughter had been warm, unpretentious, nothing like the careful politeness he was used to at home. That evening he had helped her assemble a wardrobe. They drank tea in her small kitchen afterward, and somewhere between those simple conversations and the smell of fresh paint, Pavlo realized something strange. For the first time in years, he felt calm. Now he looked back at his mother. "I love her," he said. Sofia's face hardened. "You don't even know what love is." "I know enough." She crossed her arms. "No, Pavlo. What you know is pity. You feel sorry for a lonely woman with a child, so you decided to save her." "That's not true." "Oh, but it is," she continued, voice sharpening. "Women like that are clever. They know exactly how to pull on a man's heart." Pavlo's patience snapped. "Stop calling her like that." His voice echoed louder than he intended. For a moment they simply stared at each other, mother and son. Two people who loved each other deeply and yet stood on opposite sides of something neither of them could cross. Finally, Sofia spoke again, quiet at this time. "If you walk out that door for her," she said slowly, "don't expect me to welcome you back." Pavlo felt the familiar pressure in his temples. "I'm not leaving you, Mom," he said. "I'm just starting my own family." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she whispered something almost inaudible. "You already had one." And in that moment, Pavlo understood that to his mother, any woman who entered his life would always be an enemy, a rival, someone who was stealing what she believed had always belonged to her, her son. Pavlo left the apartment before the argument could grow into something uglier. The heavy metal door slammed behind him, and the echo rolled through the stairwell like distant thunder. For a moment, he simply stood there on the landing, staring at the cracked concrete steps he had run up and down since childhood. The same stairwell, the same walls smelling faintly of dust and cabbage soup. Only now, it felt smaller. Outside, the evening air of Vinica greeted him with a cold drizzle. Streetlights reflected in thin puddles along the pavement, turning the asphalt into a dull mirror. Pavlo pulled his jacket tighter around himself and started walking without thinking about direction. His heart was still beating too fast. Every argument with his mother left him feeling like he had just run a long distance, breathless, guilty, and strangely tired. He told himself he was doing the right thing, but Sofia Nikolaevna had a way of planting doubts like small poisonous seeds. He tried to shake them away. 15 minutes later, he stood in front of a familiar 5-story building in the Vishenka district. Its entrance light flickered lazily, buzzing like an old insect trapped in glass. Olena lived on the 3rd floor. He typed the code on the intercom. The door clicked open. Inside, the stairwell smelled completely different from his own. Cinnamon, laundry powder, and something sweet. Probably pastries from the bakery downstairs. Before he could even reach the door, it swung open. A small boy with messy brown hair stood there holding a toy airplane. "Uncle Pavlo!" Dennis shouted happily. His eyes lit up the way children's eyes do when they see someone they trust completely. Pavlo felt the tension in his shoulders melt instantly. "Hey, pilot," he said with a smile. The boy ran straight into him, nearly knocking him backward. "You came! Mom said you might be late. We are making cherry dumplings." "Serious business," Pavlo nodded solemnly. "Do you need reinforcements?" Dennis grabbed his hand and pulled him inside. The apartment was warm. The kitchen light glowed softly, and the smell of cherries and dough filled the air. Olena stood by the table, dusting flour from her hands onto her apron. She looked up. For a moment, she simply studied his face. Pavlo always felt that Olena could read him faster than anyone else. "You look exhausted," she said gently. Her voice carried the calm warmth that had drawn him in from the very beginning. "Long day," he replied. "That kind of long day?" she asked quietly. Pavlo hesitated. She already knew the answer. "Mom again," he admitted. Olena sighed softly but didn't comment. Instead, she stepped closer and brushed a small invisible speck from his jacket sleeve. "You should wash your hands," she said. "Dennis is the chief dumpling inspector tonight, but his standards are suspiciously low." "Hey!" the boy protested from the table. "Mine are perfect." They laughed. Soon, all 3 of them stood around the kitchen table. Flour covered the surface like fresh snow. Dennis attempted to fold the dough around cherries, producing shapes that looked more like abstract sculptures than dumplings. Olena laughed every time one burst open. "Those are experimental," Dennis declared proudly. Pavlo watched them both, the boy's excited chatter, Olena's tired but warm smile, the comfortable chaos of an ordinary evening. And suddenly the contrast struck him. At home, everything was spotless, controlled, quiet. Here the kitchen was messy, but it felt alive. For a few precious minutes, Pavlo allowed himself to forget the argument, his mother's cold words, the tension waiting for him back there. Here there was laughter. Here there was warmth. Here, for the first time in years, Pavlo felt something he barely remembered. Peace. Later, when Dennis finally went to bed and the apartment grew quiet, Pavlo reached into his pocket and felt the velvet box again. The sharp corners pressed into his palm. He hadn't planned to do it tonight, but after the fight with his mother, something inside him had changed. He realized he didn't want to wait anymore. The apartment grew quiet after Dennis went to bed. His small bedroom door closed with a soft click, and soon the muffled rustle of blankets faded into the steady breathing of a child already deep in sleep. The kitchen lamp cast a warm yellow circle over the table still dusted with flour. A few crooked dumplings waited on a plate, survivors of Denis's experimental cooking. Olena stood at the sink rinsing the last cups. Water flowed over the porcelain with a soft, calming sound. Pavlo watched her for a long moment. Strands of her dark hair had escaped the loose knot at the back of her head. A thin line of flour still crossed her cheek like pale chalk. She looked tired, real, and strangely beautiful in the ordinary light of the kitchen. For a moment, Pavlo wondered if he had a right to bring his storm into this peaceful place. But the velvet box in his pocket reminded him why he had come. He stood up slowly. "Olena," he said. She turned off the water and dried her hands on the towel, sensing something different in his voice. "Yes?" Pavlo stepped closer and placed the small box on the table between them. The soft fabric seemed darker under the lamp. Olena's eyes widened slightly. "Pavlo." "I know," he said quickly, his voice unsteady. "I know it hasn't been long, and I know life hasn't been easy for you. Maybe this is sudden." He opened the box. Inside, a simple gold ring caught the warm light. He searched for the right words. "I don't want to go back to the life I had before. I want mornings here. Evenings like this. I want to help Denis with homework and complain about broken faucets and burned pancakes." Olena stared at the ring. "I want us," Pavlo finished quietly. For a few seconds the kitchen was completely silent. Then Olena sat down slowly, as if her knees had suddenly weakened. "You're serious?" she whispered. "Completely." She rubbed her temples with her fingers. "Pavlo, you know what your mother thinks about me." "Yes." "And you know she will never accept this." "I know." Olena looked up at him. Her eyes held both warmth and deep worry. "She came to my work today," she said softly. The words fell into the room like a dropped glass. Pavlo blinked. "What?" "She stood by the cashier desk while customers were waiting. She didn't shout. She didn't insult me openly." Olena smiled bitterly. "That would have been easier." "What did she say?" Olena hesitated. Then she repeated the words slowly. She said, "Have some conscience, young woman. My son deserves a real life. Don't drag him into your past mistakes." Pavlo felt heat rush to his face. "I'm so sorry." "Everyone in the store heard it," Olena continued quietly. "They all looked at me like I was some kind of thief." She looked at the ring again. "You see the problem?" Pavlo clenched his jaw. "Yes," he said. "My mother." Olena nodded. "She won't stop, Pavlo. Not after you leave her apartment. Not after this." For a moment he felt the weight of the choice pressing on him again. Mother. Or the small kitchen filled with flour and warmth. But this time the answer felt clearer than ever. Pavlo closed the distance between them and knelt beside her chair. "I can't control what she says," he admitted, "but I can control what I choose." He took Olena's hand. "And I choose you." Her fingers trembled slightly in his. "What if she hates me forever?" Olena asked. Pavlo exhaled slowly. "She already does." A small sad smile appeared on Olena's lips. "That's honest, at least." He slipped the ring gently onto her finger. It fit perfectly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside the apartment continued as usual. Distant cars, the hum of the city, the whisper of rain on the windows. Inside the kitchen, two people sat quietly, knowing that the hardest part of their story had not even begun yet. And somewhere across the city, Sofia Mikolaevna was already planning her next move. The next morning, Pavlo woke before dawn. The apartment was still quiet, filled with that deep morning silence when even the city seems to pause between breaths. For a few seconds he lay still, staring at the pale ceiling, trying to understand why the room felt unfamiliar. Then he remembered. He was not at his mother's apartment. He was on Olena's small couch in the living room, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of laundry powder and cherries. The memory of the previous evening returned slowly. The ring, Olena's trembling smile, Denise speaking sleepily from the hallway. And the decision. Pavlo sat up and rubbed his face. Outside the window, the sky was barely turning grey. Somewhere in the distance, a tram rattled along its rails, the sound echoing through the quiet streets. In the kitchen, he found Olena already awake. She stood by the stove in a soft sweater, stirring something in a small saucepan. Her hair was still messy from sleep. "You didn't have to wake up so early," Pavlo said gently. She turned and smiled, though her eyes carried worry. "Habit," she replied. "Dennis has school." The boy himself appeared moments later, dragging his backpack along the floor. "Good morning," he mumbled. "Morning, pilot," Pavlo said. Dennis suddenly noticed Olena's hand. "Mom, what's that?" Olena glanced at the ring. For a moment she seemed unsure what to say. Then Pavlo spoke. "It means your mom and I want to build a family." Dennis blinked twice. Then his face broke into a grin. "Does that mean you live with us?" Olena laughed quietly. "We'll see," she said. But Pavlo noticed something behind her smile, a shadow of doubt. Later that afternoon, he returned to his mother's apartment to collect his things. The building looked exactly the same as always. Grey walls, old balconies, the familiar smell of damp concrete. Yet the entrance felt different now, as if you were entering a place that no longer belonged to him. When he opened the door with his key, Sofia Nikolaevna was already waiting. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. "I was wondering when you'd come back," she said calmly. Pavlo placed his bag by the wall. "I came for my things." Her eyes moved slowly over his face. "You stayed with her last night." It wasn't a question. "Yes." Sofia sighed, shaking her head slightly. "You really are serious about destroying your life." Pavlo felt the old anger rising again. "I'm not destroying anything." "You're abandoning your mother," she replied quietly. The softness in her voice almost sounded like pain. "I raised you alone. I sacrificed everything. And now you choose some woman with a child over your own blood." "I'm not choosing between you," Pavlo said firmly. "I'm choosing my future." Her fingers tightened around the cup. "You think she loves you?" Sofia asked suddenly. "Yes." A thin smile appeared on her lips. "You're naive, Pavlo. Women like her don't fall in love. They calculate." He shook his head. "You don't know her." "Oh, but I do," Sofia said softly. She stood up and walked toward the window. "I made a few calls." Pavlo felt a chill crawl along his spine. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she continued calmly, "that some stories repeat themselves. Her previous husband left for a reason." Pavlo stared at her. "You investigated her?" "A mother protects her son." The words hung in the air like a quiet threat. Pavlo suddenly realized something that made his chest tighten. This was not just disapproval. This was war. And Sofia Nikolaevna had only begun fighting. As he packed his suitcase in the old bedroom, he heard her voice drifting from the kitchen. "You can go to her now," she called. "But remember one thing, Pavlo." Her tone turned cold again. "No woman will ever love you the way your mother does." For the first time in his life, Pavlo understood how dangerous those words could be. The weeks that followed felt like walking across thin ice. At first, nothing dramatic happened. Pavlo moved into a small rented apartment not far from Olena's building. It was a modest one-room place with peeling wallpaper and an old sofa that creaked every time he turned. But for the first time in his life, the space belonged entirely to him. Freedom felt strange, sometimes even frightening. Every evening he walked the familiar path to Olena's apartment. Dennis greeted him at the door like an excited puppy, waving school notebooks and endless stories about teachers, football matches, and imaginary airplanes. Life slowly began forming new rhythms. Yet beneath that fragile calm, tension lingered like distant thunder. Sofia Nikolaevna did not disappear. She called relatives, neighbors, even some of Pavlo's colleagues. Stories spread quickly through the quiet circles of the city. A son who had abandoned his mother, a cunning divorced woman who had trapped him, a poor elderly parent left alone. Pavlo heard about it from a colleague one afternoon at work. "Your mom called the office," the man said awkwardly. "She sounded worried about you." Pavlo simply nodded. He had expected it. What he had not expected was how deeply those whispers could still wound him. One evening, as autumn rain drummed against the windows, Pavlo sat with Olena on the balcony of her apartment. Denis had already fallen asleep inside. The city lights shimmered through the wet glass. Olena rested her head on Pavlo's shoulder. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly. "Leaving?" "Yes." Pavlo thought for a long moment. Somewhere in the distance, a tram bell rang softly. "I regret that it had to happen like this," he said finally. "But I don't regret choosing my life." Olena studied his face. "She will never forgive me." "She probably won't," Pavlo admitted. Silence settled between them again. "I sometimes wonder," Olena said slowly, "if I became your enemy the moment you loved me." Pavlo looked at the rain sliding down the balcony railing. "My mother spent 30 years building a world where I belonged only to her," he said. "Anyone who stepped into that world was automatically an intruder." Olena squeezed his hand. "You know, some mothers love their children by letting them go." Pavlo gave a sad smile. "And some love them by holding on so tightly they forget their children need air to breathe." Inside the apartment, Denis stirred in his sleep, murmuring something about airplanes. The sound made Pavlo smile. That small voice, that messy kitchen, those evenings filled with laughter, all of it felt fragile, yet real, real enough to fight for. Months passed. The rumor slowly faded. Sofia Nikolaevna retreated into the role she had chosen, the wounded mother telling her story to anyone willing to listen. Pavlo still sent her money, still asked neighbors to check on her, but he no longer allowed guilt to dictate his life. Distance became the only boundary that kept everyone alive. One crisp autumn morning, high in the Carpathian Mountains during a short vacation, Pavlo knelt once again before Olena. Wind whipped through the tall grass around them. Clouds drifted below the ridge like a white sea. "Last time I asked you in a kitchen full of flour," he said with a nervous smile. "This time I want to do it properly." Olena laughed through tears. "Yes," she answered before he even finished. Their wedding months later was simple. A civil ceremony, a small dinner with friends, Denis proudly carrying flowers. Sofia Nikolaevna did not come. Pavlo sent an invitation anyway. It returned unopened. That evening, after the celebration ended and Denis had fallen asleep in the new apartment they now share, Pavlo stood by the window looking at the quiet city. Olena wrapped her arms around him from behind. "Happy?" she asked softly. He turned and kissed her forehead. "Yes," he said. Then he added thoughtfully, "Sometimes love isn't about choosing the right person. Sometimes it's about having the courage to step out of the wrong story." Outside, the city lights shimmered quietly, and for the first time in a long while, Pavlo felt that his life truly belonged to him.